Welcome and thank you for joining for part 3 of our webinar series about webinars. So if you've been with us since the beginning, we started by talking about planning your webinar program, and then we dug into the promotional strategy, and now we are going to talk about presenting webinars with confidence and how you can enable your speakers to be the most comfortable behind the camera talking to your audience. So I am Lauren Krales. I am the marketing strategist at CTG, where we help teams overcome capacity gaps by providing hands-on marketing support. Today on your platform, if you've not been here before, everything you need is in that panel on the right-hand side of your screen. So there is a chat there. That comes directly to me and only to me. So that's where you can submit any questions. And then there's a handout tab as well that I've shared our webinar program workbook. And lastly, that's where a poll will pop up too once we get to it. So with that, let's get into the discussion. And before you start having those conversations with your speakers to help coach them through the content or help them with the platform, you really need to determine who your speakers are. And that sounds obvious, but it's not always that the expert on the topic is the person who should be delivering the content, and vice versa. Your best speaker might not be the one who has the most experience with the content. So working with your team to determine who the best person to deliver the content in a way that you're hoping to achieve your goals is obviously step number one. And then those next 2 bullet points on familiarity with the topic is super important, because your speaker could be an expert at the topic in general, but then has specific expertise depending on how that topic breaks down. And when looking at the audience as well, if I was speaking today to a group of HVAC technicians, just for example, and I was telling you the HVAC technicians about webinars, they might not have that background contextual knowledge, where if I was speaking to a group of marketers, they would definitely know a little bit more about organizing events and what they would need to get from point A to point B. So understanding your speaker's expertise and your audience's base knowledge is going to help determine where you start, what you need to cover, and how you can tailor the content to really achieve the goals and get what you need out of the session. So those last 2, with the key takeaways and your speaker's expertise, that's what I want you to focus on, because if you don't set those aside in the beginning or in that first conversation with the speakers, it's going to be much more challenging to guide the conversation and help it achieve your business goals. Because, of course, you can have a great speaker join your session and they can tell stories and they can talk about 10 different things that they see as important, but a lot of times those speakers will get distracted as well. Or if you don't provide that structure and the guidance of, okay, what are the key takeaways that we need this audience to walk away from, and what is your expertise to get them there, then it's going to be a lot harder to connect those dots, and you might end up with a rambling session, which is, of course, what you don't want. And with that, I would like to ask this group a quick poll on what stands out with a good webinar presenter and what do you picture. So that is over on that right-hand side for you. And a few of the options are clarity of the message, confidence in delivery, and ability to simplify complex ideas, or the natural conversation style. So all of these are important, and if you've done any speaking, you know that these are kind of floating in your head the whole time. And even I'm not an expert speaker. I'm usually the one just behind the scenes helping run the program. And so a lot of these things are naturally much easier said than done. So with that, it looks like we had a split between simplifying complex ideas and the natural conversation style, which is exactly what I don't know. I expect all of them. I think they're all super important, but I think this tells us that being conversational is going to resonate with your audience more often than sharing a ton of stats or sharing a bunch of details. So thank you guys for participating in that. I really appreciate it. It's helpful to just guide the conversation. And so at CTG, we have 3 focus areas for speaker preparation and structuring the content. So you'll hear me say that a lot is what is the structure and why are we doing it? Those are the 2 things that will really help you coach your speakers, or if you're speaking, help you be prepared to deliver the material. Starting with clear and usable scripts. I use scripts lightly because you don't want a script, is the moral of the story. You don't want someone to sit there and read line for line what they've typed out or what maybe AI has written for them. So that is what you want to avoid. And how you can avoid having it feel like someone is reading a script is by focusing on these 4 points. So the key talking points is something that helps with the content and the flow and making sure that you have a structure. You have different sections. You have the talking points. You know what your speakers are going to talk about, and they know as well. Because if you keep it broad, and that's the biggest mistake we see, is our clients are choosing a webinar topic that's super broad, and it provides this umbrella of ambiguity where the speaker is like, okay, so I can talk about lawn care maintenance, but I don't know, do you want to talk about growing grass? Are you looking for weed management? Do you want to know about irrigation? And so that is just an example as I look out my window. But if you can define those key talking points, structure your ideas, that is going to help your speaker feel more confident coming to the session, knowing that they have the expertise that you're looking for to achieve the goals at the end of the session. And with transitions and interaction timing, those 2, what we like to use is determining who is going to lead each slide. And what I mean by that is who's going to speak the most about that topic, because this does a couple of things. It helps the speaker be prepared to be like, okay, yeah, I really need to know what I want to cover, and I can make recommendations on the slide. And it helps if you're using an internal speaker or a moderator to help tee up those speakers. So thank you so much. That was a great point. That moves us into our next topic, where, John, could you tell us a little bit about what you're seeing in XYZ? And so that's just an example, having those clear lines of who is speaking when, who is speaking about what, and making sure that there are those interactions mapped out in the script. With the interaction timing, those will be determined in your prep calls as well, because you can put in there that John wants to make a comment after Sarah says this topic, or he has an example, or he wants to jump in, and then Sarah can tell John, hey John, when we were preparing for this, you'd mentioned something, I want to highlight that, and it can go from there much more smoothly. Which that ties really closely into the rehearsals, because we recommend having 2 prep calls with your speakers at least. And that first one is where you're really going to share the topic with them, understand their expertise, and see, yeah, they know lawn care maintenance, and they are an expert in the irrigation and the growing grass piece of it. And so that's where you really want to focus. So that's prep call 1, is understanding what focus areas they have and how you can lean into those to still achieve your goal. Because you want your speaker to kind of nerd out about the topic that you've invited them to speak for, because the audience can feel that and they know that there's the passion there, the expertise, and it builds that much more trust. So that's prep call number one. And then prep call number two is closer to a dry run. That is where you would have them join in the webinar platform and review what all the lights and buttons and gizmos do on the back end, because taking away that barrier of confusion or intimidation of a new system, because let's be honest, not all platforms are extremely user friendly. And if you can get them in there, let them poke around, tell them what everything does, what they don't want to touch. And a lot of times they'll be like, okay, great, I know what 2 buttons to use, and they are pretty adaptable. So that can help. And then the handoffs we touched on, and timing and pacing. Some speakers will want to use that dry run time to actually go through the content, and that's great. And you can do that. Some speakers will be like, nope, I'll just be ready. I just need to know when I'm going to talk, who's going to hand it to me, and what I need to talk about. And so a lot of times that second prep call is more for the technical side of it, and to make sure that they feel confident and they feel comfortable in the system. Comfort is what you're going for, because we all are much more personable. We are much more well-spoken if we are comfortable in that setting. That leads me to delivery-friendly presentation material. You've heard of the presentation material needing to be user-friendly and for people to be able to understand it. But one thing that I like to do is add speaker cues into the slides, because not everyone likes to use notes, or if you're doing something in a new platform, then there's like different screens and boxes, and it can be overwhelming to have like a split screen, or there's different notifications popping up. So adding cues in the slides in a subtle way. So if you know that you want to talk about simplifying slide content and you want to make a comment on this, including that on the slides is going to help the speaker worry about less, know that everything they need is on there, that they can reference it if they need to, and it'll help tell the story from start to finish. One thing when you are creating the materials or you're going through that dry run with the speakers, a lot of times we see that that's where you'll find what you've missed. So you can do the prep, you can do like the preparation with your team, you can do the prep calls with the speakers, but it isn't until the content's at about 85-90% where the glaring obvious things that you miss stand out. So when you're in those final days leading up to your webinar, you can have that 90-foot view of your content and say, I think that we should move this poll up here. It really ties into this content a little bit more. Or I think that we should add a little bit at the end because we're kind of missing our point, or we haven't communicated that enough up until here, even though we had planned on it. So that all comes down to organizing that content and having those materials in a way that help guide your speaker through the story versus relying on them to tell the story. I'm going to repeat that. Use your slides to guide your speaker through the story you want them to tell. Don't rely on them as being a speaker and a subject matter expert to tell the story you're anticipating. Okay. And so I wanted to include on here a few of these best practices. I've covered some of them and I've jumped over a couple others, but anytime that you can have more than one speaker, it's going to be more engaging for your audience. And the poll shows that. So when we just did that poll, and some of you had said that that natural conversational style, those podcast feeling sessions are going to resonate in the brain. They're going to build that trust and those connections much more than even we're not following our own advice, me speaking to you about this content. So having more than one speaker, even that internal speaker being a moderator and making sure that everything goes smoothly, and then maybe having that external subject matter expert. I would avoid having more than 4 speakers total. So an internal speaker and 3 guests. I think that that can get overwhelming, especially if you are, say you have 30 minutes, say you have an hour. It doesn't leave those speakers enough time to showcase their expertise in a way that they truly deserve for the amount of prep that goes into the session. So I would cap it at about 4. And then we touched on honing in on their expertise and a little bit about categorizing your content. So if you've never done a webinar before, if you are restarting your webinar program, the most simple framework that you can follow is overview, deep dive, best practices. This is the most broadly applicable structure that you can use, and your audience will see value in that because you've laid it out simply. And that would start with an overview, why it's important, state of the industry, and then you'll get into those details of the nitty gritty of your irrigation system or of your growing grass in the backyard and what that looks like, what the schedule is, what the timing is, and what they need to be aware of. And then wrapping it up with a high level best practices to just reiterate that point of what do you want your audience to walk away with, and what do you want your speakers to maybe repeat again. And so that is how I would recommend structuring your webinar. And then we talked about leading each slide. That's a no-brainer. That will help with the speakers interrupting each other. It will help with just awkward pauses in between sessions. Those transitional phrases are really helpful. And that ties into prompting questions as well. So you can know that John's going to lead slide 5, but to make that a smooth transition, you can tee John up properly to get right into it, and it feels more conversational so that it doesn't just click, there's a lag, John's supposed to speak, and then he goes, okay, I'm going to tell you guys about this. So have that transition of what are you seeing? What is the most important thing that people often miss? Those transitional prompting questions help the flow feel much more natural and conversational. And then we had talked about those prep calls. There's just a little more detail about timing on there. I would say that initial one is at least 3 weeks in advance. If you join the promotion session, you know that's about when you'd start promos as well, so that if your speaker says something that wasn't originally in your promos, you should still have time to make those adjustments. And then that dry run closer to about a week in advance so that you've honed down that content and you can make those 90-foot view calls of what you may have missed. Whew. Even though they're just 20-minute sessions, being just one speaker, I kind of get rambling and it takes a lot out of you. But with that, thank you. We are up next. We have one more session on executing webinars that deliver data. So the key components of that discussion are going to be the little details during the live session that help make it feel relatable for your audience. And additionally, what are you tracking? What changes need to be made? And how can you make the most out of the data that you're getting out of your webinar program to make adjustments moving forward? And there is a little pitch there of the webinar program workbook, which you can find on that handout tab on your right-hand side. If you have not downloaded that yet, I would just recommend taking a look. Maybe you use your own system already. There's about 90 tasks in there and our recommended timing, so it is a great resource. With that, I would like to open it up for Q&A. And this is a great time to, if you're starting your webinar program or revisiting it, please ask me any questions and I am happy to dig into those. Let's see. One that we have here is, how do you adapt when speakers are busy or hard to get time with? Which, this is a great one, and I'm sure we've all faced it because you're dealing with VPs, you're dealing with the C-suite or executives, and these subject matter experts, they don't feel like they have time to put in a ton of prep calls and exchanging emails with the webinar or the marketing team to prepare for this event, but they want to be prepared. So that is a misconception. And the last thing you want to do if someone is hard to get a hold of is to be like, oh, I'm sure they have it. I'm sure they're fine. I'm sure they don't need anything. Because going back to that comfort state, you want them to feel comfortable before the session starts, that they know what they're talking about. They know what you're going to ask them. They know what all the buttons do. And that's how you'll get the most out of their contribution. So what I would recommend if you're facing this challenge is consider restructuring your webinar. If you haven't gotten much input from them besides, yeah, I can speak on July 16th at 2 p.m., then you really want to look at your structure of your webinar and consider a fireside chat instead. So maybe you're not going through those best practices in a structured way that could pigeonhole them, but you are providing them with a list of questions, getting their like thumbs up or thumbs down on if they're okay with being asked those questions. And if you can structure those in like a time-stamped list to give to them, hey, we're going to do an overview, then we'll talk about this, where I'm going to ask you a couple of these, we'll do a poll, then we'll get into this section with questions 5, 6, and 7, and then we'll leave time for Q&A. That's going to make them feel much more prepared and more comfortable. One other tip for this is to leave your door open, quote unquote. Let them know, hey, here's all this information. We do have a prep call to get you behind the system, but if you want to go through content, I'm open anytime. Let me know, because what will happen is the day before, the morning of, you'll get a message from them. They'll want changes, they'll have questions, and you can jump on with them and talk them through the logic, or you can make those changes to help make sure that you're on the same page going into that live session. So clearly, I have a lot of tips on that one. If that's something you're running into continuously, please, I'm happy to talk about that more with you. Okay. All right. It doesn't look like I have any more questions in there. And so with that, I just want to thank you so much for those of you who are watching, and especially if you've attended sessions 1 and 2. I hope to see you on July 30th for that final session. And if there's anything that we can do to help with your webinar program, or if you just want to chat and say, hey, this is what I'm running into, do you have ideas? I'm more than happy to have a light conversation and talk through your situation with you. So with that, thank you so much. My email is there, our website is there, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.